By late 1944, Imperial Japan was conducting a strategic reassessment under tightening constraints. Fewer secure sea lanes, fewer trained air crews, and a shrinking perimeter of forward bases. In that setting, planners explored strike concepts meant to bypass Allied naval and air superiority by reaching targets at long distance, including operations directed at the United States homeland. Operation Cherryblossom, more precisely known in surviving descriptions as Operation PX or Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night, emerged from the intersection of two pre-existing capabilities rather than from a single new invention. One was an established Japanese Army biological warfare apparatus. Unit 731, organized under the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department and active from 1936 to 1945 in Japanese-controlled Manchuria, conducted research and production related to pathogens and delivery methods, including the use of vectors such as fleas for plague transmission. The other was an Imperial Japanese Navy effort to create a platform for surprise air attack at intercontinental range. The Sentoku I-400 class submarine aircraft carriers designed to carry and launch Aichi M6A1 Seirin floatplanes. Construction began in January 1943. The program was repeatedly reduced from its initial planned scale, and 3 boats were completed by July 1945. The legal and diplomatic background also mattered to how decision-makers framed risks. The 1925 Geneva Protocol prohibited the use in war of bacteriological methods and chemical weapons, but adherence varied, and Japan did not ratify the protocol until 1970. That meant the late war debate inside Japanese institutions took place in a world where formal prohibitions existed, but enforcement depended on outcomes of the war and post-war accountability. Within Japan, the concept of using biological agents against American cities was discussed alongside other long-range strike proposals. The I-400 program itself had been linked to plans for attacks on distant infrastructure targets using Seirin aircraft, and by mid-1945, some of these submarines and aircraft were training for night operations for planned surprise raids. The biological attack concept proposed a different payload and a different target set. Population centers on the U.S. West Coast, with planning described as beginning in December 1944 and reaching a finalized form on March 26, 1945. The personnel associated in later accounts include senior naval staff figures, including Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa and Army medical leadership linked to Unit 731, Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, while opposition within the Army High Command is tied to Chief of the Army General Staff General Yoshijiro Umezu. From the American perspective, the mainland United States was not a principal battlefield in 1944 to 45, but it was not treated as immune from attack. The West Coast had experienced wartime air defense measures, coastal surveillance, and civil defense preparations since 1942, shaped by earlier episodes of Japanese submarine activity, and the broader expectation that unconventional or isolated raids were possible even when the main campaigns were fought thousands of kilometers away. In strategic terms, a hypothetical biological strike did not need to defeat U.S. armed forces directly to be considered militarily relevant by its planners. It aimed instead at disrupting mobilization, public health, and confidence on the home front, while forcing diversion of resources to domestic defense. Thus, the preconditions for Operation Cherryblossom were not a single turning point, but a convergence. An Army-run biological warfare capability developed earlier in the war, a Navy investment in submarine-borne aviation for long-range surprise attack, and a late-war leadership environment weighing high-risk options under deteriorating military conditions and under the shadow of international prohibitions whose practical consequences would depend on the war's end state. In the winter of 1944 to 45, the idea that later became known as Operation Cherryblossom moved from a speculative concept into a staff-level proposal tied to identifiable units and platforms. The earliest surviving timeline places the start of planning in December 1944, when Japanese officers examined whether long-range surprise delivery was feasible using assets already under development, rather than building a new force from scratch. The proposal was discussed in parallel with other late-war strike concepts, reflecting a broader shift from sustained operations towards single, high-risk attacks intended to create disruption disproportionate to the resources expended. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, the operational nucleus was the submarine aircraft carrier project. The I-400 class boats were designed to approach distant coasts, surface, and launch a small number of aircraft. By early 1945, crews and pilots associated with the Saran program were training for night operations because surprise depended on minimizing warning time and exploiting gaps in patrol coverage. The submarines themselves were scarce and still coming into service, so any plan that relied on them required accepting severe limits on sortie numbers, backup options, and the ability to repeat an attack. For the Imperial Japanese Army, the opening phase consisted less of troop movement than of institutional coordination. The biological warfare establishment had been built for operations on the Asian mainland, with production and handling systems integrated into an army structure. Adapting any of that capability to an intercontinental raid required agreement on responsibility, security, and mission priority at a time when Japan's armed services often competed for influence and resources. The proposal's advocates argued that a limited number of delivery vehicles could still impose large defensive burdens on the enemy. Skeptics, including senior officers in the Army High Command in later accounts, emphasized the uncertainty of results, the danger of escalation and retaliation, and the risk that scarce strategic assets would be diverted from immediate defensive needs. From the American side, this planning phase was largely invisible in operational terms. U.S. wartime security on the West Coast had already been shaped by earlier submarine incidents and air defense alerts, but U.S. command attention in early 1945 was concentrated on the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and preparations for Okinawa and possible later operations against Japan. That meant that the Japanese concept, if attempted, was designed to exploit the fact that the United States could not concentrate all surveillance and air defense resources on domestic coastal cities without affecting the main Pacific campaigns. By late March 1945, accounts of the plan describe it as having reached a more definite form, with a proposed target set on the U.S. mainland and a tentative execution window later in 1945. This transition from idea to operational outline did not mean the attack had begun. It meant that Japanese planners were trying to convert capability into a specific mission. At the same time, Japan's overall strategic position was narrowing rapidly. The opening phase, in practice, was a race between planning ambition and the accelerating loss of time, fuel, trained personnel, and secure operating space that any long-range raid would require. By early 1945, the planning logic behind Operation Cherryblossom rested on a specific trade. Japan could not generate sustained air or naval pressure near North America, but it could attempt a single, long-range surprise action intended to force the United States to divert attention and resources to homeland defense and public health. In the staff arguments that survive in later summaries, advocates describe the objective as disruption at the strategic level rather than battlefield gain, create an outbreak risk in major coastal cities, generate uncertainty about further attacks, and compel defensive reallocations during ongoing Pacific campaigns. The plan depended on platforms built for a different mission. The Sentoku I-400 class submarines were conceived as long-range submarine aircraft carriers, initially in a program that was repeatedly reduced. Only 3 boats were completed. Their design combined endurance with a short, intense launch cycle. A watertight hangar about 31 meters long and 3.5 meters in diameter was built to stow 3 Aichi M6A1 Seiran aircraft. The conning tower was offset to allow centerline storage and catapult launch. Published specifications for the class include a surfaced range on the order of 37,500 nautical miles at 14 knots, a figure used to illustrate that trans-Pacific missions were technically feasible without refueling. The aircraft itself shaped operational planning. the Seiran was designed for compact storage, wings and tail folded, and floats could be attached shortly before launch. Its standard crew was 2, and described payload options include either a single heavy bomb load around 800 kilograms or a torpedo of comparable weight. Training materials and later technical summaries describe a rapid preparation concept. A small team could ready an aircraft in about 7 minutes, and a submarine could launch its 3 aircraft in roughly 3/4 of an hour under ideal conditions. Operation Cherryblossom repurposed that delivery mechanism for biological payloads rather than conventional ordnance. In the version most often described, Seiran aircraft would be launched at night off Southern California and release containers meant to disperse plague-infected fleas over urban areas, with San Diego commonly cited as the focal target and a proposed execution date of 22 September 1945. Some accounts specify 15 aircraft, implying 5 submarines carrying 3 Seirans each, a force level that exceeded the number of Sentoku boats actually completed and highlights the gap between operational aspiration and available assets. The plan also faced internal planning contradictions. At the same time these submarines were being prepared for intercontinental tasks, the Navy was training Seiran units for a strike against the Panama Canal's Gatun locks, including night operations practice in June 1945, and detailed study of the lock system. This overlap meant Cherryblossom competed with other high-priority missions for the same scarce submarines, air crews, fuel, and maintenance capacity. From the American perspective, the strategic planning baseline was different. The United States concentrated its main effort on the Pacific's forward theaters, but coastal defense and public health measures already existed as standing systems rather than ad hoc inventions. Military surveillance, civil defense, quarantine practice, and vector control expertise. Japanese planners had to assume their attack would be detected after the first indicators, and that containment measures would begin quickly, meaning the intended effect depended on speed of spread and on local ecological conditions. Modern medical reviews of plague emphasize that outbreaks are not mechanically predictable because transmission depends on complex interactions among vectors, hosts, and environment. That uncertainty was part of the risk calculation on both sides. For Japan, whether the effect would justify expending strategic platforms; for the United States, how much to divert to a threat that was plausible but difficult to quantify. These planning realities help explain why the operation remained at the level of proposal. Multiple sources describe the plan as reaching a decision point in late March 1945 and being rejected after opposition within the Japanese Army High Command, including General Yoshijiro Umezu, who is repeatedly cited as blocking implementation. In early 1945, the force elements associated with long-range submarine aviation began encountering the kinds of friction that shaped what could be executed in practice. The first direct contact with the enemy came not from an outbound raid, but from Allied pressure on Japan's naval bases. On 19 March 1945, U.S. carrier aircraft struck the Kure area during operations against ships and facilities in the Inland Sea. I-400 was in dry dock and was strafed, returned fire with 25mm guns, and suffered at least one fatality among its crew. That episode did not involve Operation Cherryblossom itself, but it demonstrated the core operational problem shared by all late-war plans relying on the I-400 program. Aircraft carrier submarines could be built to extend reach, yet their readiness still depended on ports, training areas, and supply chains exposed to increasingly frequent Allied air attack. The most concrete first engagements in the operational sense were the training cycles intended to turn the Seiran concept into a repeatable procedure. By early June 1945, the submarines of Submarine Division 1 were concentrated for workups, and Seiran units were brought together with them for night flight preparation. On June 5 to 6, 1945, the assembled force at Nanao Bay included UR-400 and I-401, along with other aircraft-carrying submarines, joined by Seiran aircraft from the 631st Naval Air Group, Formal training for night air operations began on June 6th in preparation for a Panama Canal strike plan that envisioned 10 Sirens attacking the Gatun locks with a mix of torpedoes and bombs. The training cycle emphasized speed and concealment. Aircraft had to be assembled from a folded stowed configuration, moved to the catapult, launched, and, in recovery scenarios, ditched for pickup. The sequence was designed to minimize the time a submarine would be surfaced and vulnerable. As training progressed, the limits of personnel and conditions became evident. Plans on paper assumed torpedo attacks and precise timing, but pilot experience, mechanical reliability, and weather were variables that could not be standardized. Contemporary retellings of the Panama Canal preparation describe a full-scale mock-up of the lock gates built for practice and note aircraft losses during training, reflecting the risk inherent in repeated launch and attack drills even before enemy contact. In staff terms, these were not combat losses, but they were operational attrition that reduced the pool of trained crews available for any mission that used the same submarines and aircraft, including hypothetical alternative payloads, such as those discussed under Cherryblossom. For the United States, there was no corresponding opening engagement against the Cherryblossom force because no deployment for that mission occurred. The relevant comparison is asymmetrical. Japan's preparation phase took place under direct pressure on its home waters and training infrastructure, while U.S. defensive systems on the West Coast were not forced into a specific response cycle tied to this plan. The first measurable outcomes, therefore, were internal to the attacker's preparation: readiness degraded by airstrikes, training hazards, and the need to keep strategic assets dispersed and moving, rather than external effects on the intended targets. From spring 1945, the environment in which Operation Cherryblossom was discussed changed faster than the plan itself. On April 1, 1945, U.S. forces landed on Okinawa, beginning a campaign that lasted until late June. The fighting there drew Japanese naval and air resources into increasingly short-range missions and accelerated losses in trained personnel, aircraft, and fuel stocks. At the same time, the air war over Japan intensified. U.S. carrier strikes against the Kure area in March 1945, and subsequent raids reduced the reliability of remaining naval bases, repair capacity, and the time available for complex training cycles. For programs such as the I-400 class submarine aircraft carriers, the practical crisis was that an intercontinental raid required months of preparation, while the conditions needed for preparation were being eroded week by week. The submarine force itself had limited redundancy. The intercontinental concept assumed multiple boats could be fueled, fitted, and worked up together, then dispatched with enough margin to absorb mechanical failures and combat damage. In reality, the I-400 program produced only a small number of operational holes, and late war damage and repairs reduced availability further. Some boats were being modified with snorkels to extend submerged endurance, but snorkels did not solve the core problems of navigation, air search, and refueling under Allied air and sea control. Any long-range mission also demanded a secure outbound transit, and by 1945, the U.S. Navy was expanding anti-submarine patrol coverage and mining operations around Japan and along likely routes, increasing the probability that a rare strategic platform could be lost before reaching launch position. Inside Japan's command structure, the crisis was also institutional. Operation Cherryblossom required coordination across service boundaries, Army control over biological materials and methods, and Navy control over the platforms that could reach North America. Late 1944 and 1945 saw intensified competition for scarce resources, including fuel allocations and priority access to repair facilities. Proposals that did not directly support immediate defense of the home islands faced higher scrutiny. Within the Army, senior leaders had to weigh whether biological warfare, designed and tested in a continental theater, could produce a predictable effect across the Pacific, and whether the strategic consequences would be manageable. Uncertainty about results was not a technical detail, but a planning variable. Even if aircraft reached a target area, dissemination depended on weather, dispersal patterns, and the interaction between vectors and local ecology. At the same time, the possibility of retaliation had to be considered in a context where Japanese cities were already subject to large-scale air raids, and where U.S. industrial capacity and delivery systems were not in question. For the United States, escalation meant an increasingly dense operational focus on closing the war. Okinawa, strategic bombing, and preparations for potential invasion scenarios. That focus did not eliminate attention to homeland security, but it changed the threshold for what would trigger major diversion of forces. A single uncertain threat to a coastal city had to compete against immediate operational requirements in the Pacific. From a public health perspective, American institutions had experience with quarantine and vector control, but the scale and speed of response would depend on detection and attribution, and on how quickly federal and local authorities could coordinate under wartime conditions. Civilian risk existed on both sides, but in different forms. Japanese civilians were experiencing rising exposure to air attack and shortages, shaping the political atmosphere in which senior leaders debated extreme options. American civilians, in the scenario described by Cherryblossom planning, would have been exposed to a form of attack that did not depend on front lines or conventional defenses. The widening gap between the scale of Japan's remaining means and the scale of its intended effects was a defining feature of the crisis. The plan sought strategic disruption using a handful of platforms, while the war's trajectory was compressing time, increasing operational hazards, and narrowing the set of decisions that could be implemented before events overtook them. By June 1945, the submarine aviation program reached its most operationally mature point. Submarine Division 1 assembled its aircraft-carrying boats for a single-purpose cycle, concentrate scarce platforms, complete night launch training, and prepare for a one-time raid intended to exploit surprise rather than sustained combat power. In this phase, the critical decisions were not about seizing territory, but about whether Japan could execute a complex strike before attrition, fuel limits, and Allied surveillance made the attempt non-viable. In the first half of June, I-400 and I-401 trained with Seiran aircraft from the 631st Naval Air Group at Nanao Bay. The workups focused on rapid assembly from stowed configuration, catapult launch procedures, night navigation, and coordinated timing between submarines and aircraft. The planned mission at that moment was a strike on the Panama Canal's Gatun locks, with an intended package of 10 Seirans launched by multiple submarines and armed with a mix of torpedoes and bombs. The training environment itself revealed how narrow the margin was. One Seiran was lost during the workup period, reducing an already small pool of trained crews. On 12 June 1945, Imperial General Headquarters canceled the Panama Canal concept and reassigned the submarine aircraft force to a closer operational target, the U.S. fleet anchorage at Ulithi. The change was driven by strategic compression. A transoceanic mission required long preparation and transit time, while Allied attacks on Japanese bases and the pace of operations around Okinawa reduced the feasibility of a distant raid. The new plan aimed at a target still difficult to reach, but closer to Japan's remaining operating space and more directly tied to ongoing naval operations in the Central Pacific. At 13:25 on 25 June 1945, the combined fleet issued orders for the Ulithi attack, labeled Operation Arashi. The concept divided tasks across multiple submarines and roles. I-13 and I-14 were to support a reconnaissance step, transporting Nakajima C-6 Ensign aircraft for a forward-based overflight to locate carriers and major transports within the anchorage. I-400 and I-401 were then to act as the striking element, with a combined total of 6 Seiran aircraft, 3 from each submarine, scheduled for a nighttime attack timed to a full moon on the 17th of August 1945. Each Seiran was to carry a single 800-kilogram bomb, reflecting a shift from earlier mixed torpedo bomb concepts to a simpler loadout intended to reduce complexity at launch and in the attack run. As August approached, the plan entered its most precarious phase: movement toward a rendezvous point, maintenance of radio silence where possible, and attempts to coordinate timing in an environment where Allied air and surface patrol activity was increasing. The operational design required I-400 and I-401 to meet at sea before the strike, synchronize positions, then approach a launch area with enough distance to assemble, fuel, and launch aircraft while surfaced. Any delay increased exposure to detection. Any damage or mechanical failure could force abandonment because there were no alternative carriers for the aircraft. In mid-August, planning collided with events. Japanese command traffic reflected last-minute adjustments to rendezvous points and attack timing. After the Imperial announcement on August 15, 1945, that hostilities would end, some officers aboard deployed submarines questioned the credibility and finality of the message and initially continued toward the objective under existing orders. Within days, higher command transmitted cancellation instructions. The intended strike did not occur, and the crews transitioned from preparing for an offensive mission to complying with surrender procedures, including disposal of aircraft and ordnance and destruction of sensitive documents. This moment represents the operational peak not because the attack was launched, but because the force reached the final stage where launch schedules, target selection, and at-sea coordination were set against a specific date. For Operation Cherryblossom, the same constraints were decisive. The biological concept required the same rare delivery platforms and the same ability to reach a launch area undetected, while Japan's capacity to protect training, maintain readiness, and control deployment timelines narrowed toward zero as the war ended. As Japan's operational environment tightened in 1945, the projects associated with long-range submarine aviation relied on adaptation rather than expansion. The central limitation was numerical. There were not enough aircraft carrier submarines, trained crews, spare parts, or fuel stocks to compensate for losses. Planning therefore emphasized methods to reduce exposure and simplify execution, even when those choices reduced the chance of recovering crews or equipment. One adaptation was procedural. The Saran system was built around fast transitions. Aircraft stored with folded wings, rolled out, assembled, fueled, and launched with the submarine surfaced for the minimum possible time. Training placed increasing weight on night operations because darkness reduced the range and effectiveness of visual detection and could complicate aerial search patterns. Night flying, however, imposed its own constraints. Navigation accuracy, communication discipline, and the probability of mishaps in takeoff and attack runs. In practice, the program had to accept that training itself consumed aircraft and aircrew capacity through accidents and mechanical failures, reducing the margin for any real mission. A second adaptation was doctrinal. Late-war Japanese planning increasingly treated some aviation missions as one-way or limited recovery operations, not as an expression of ideology, but as a response to physics and logistics. If an aircraft could dispense with certain recovery requirements, it could take off lighter, fly farther, or attack with fewer complex steps. For submarine aviation, the recovery question mattered because float planes were designed to ditch and be retrieved, which required time on the surface and calm seas. A plan that did not prioritize recovery simplified the post-attack phase, but increased the certainty that trained crews would not return, intensifying the scarcity of personnel for subsequent operations. A third adaptation involved platform survivability. Submarines attempted to reduce detection by tighter radio discipline, route changes, and the use of equipment such as snorkels that allowed diesel operation while submerged. These measures improved endurance below the surface, but did not remove the need to surface for aircraft launch, navigation fixes, and certain maintenance tasks. For the few aircraft-carrying submarines available, each additional surfaced minute increased vulnerability to radar-equipped aircraft and surface patrols. On the Allied side, adaptation was continuous and institutional. By 1945, U.S. anti-submarine warfare combined multiple layers: long-range patrol aircraft, escort groups, radar and radio direction finding, and coordinated air-sea searches. The effect was not to make every transit impossible, but to raise the expected cost and reduce the predictability of a submarine reaching a specific launch area on a fixed schedule. The same logic applied to a hypothetical biological raid. Delivery required a submarine to arrive on time, surface, and operate in a narrow window, while Allied systems were designed to create uncertainty and force interruptions. American civil preparedness also mattered, though it was not tailored to this specific plan. Public health measures such as quarantine authority, vector control practices, and interagency coordination existed as standing capabilities that could be expanded if a disease outbreak were detected. For a biological attack concept dependent on infected vectors, the uncertainty of spread interacted with the uncertainty of detection and response. A plan could aim to create an epidemic, but once the first cases appeared, containment efforts could change the outcome quickly, especially in a setting with functioning municipal health systems and wartime federal coordination. The psychological dimension for participants was shaped by secrecy and scarcity. Japanese crews preparing for rare strategic missions operated under strict compartmentalization and shifting orders as targets changed from distant infrastructure to nearer fleet anchorages. Their morale and judgment were influenced by the tension between intensive preparation and the likelihood that the mission would be canceled, redirected, or overtaken by events. For American sailors and civilians, the perceived threat environment was broader than any single plan. Sporadic raids, submarines offshore, and the possibility of unconventional attack were treated as risks to be managed, not as a separate war. In 1945, both sides adapted within asymmetrical constraints, Japan attempting to preserve a small number of complex assets long enough to matter, and the United States widening detection and response systems to make surprise less decisive. The decisive turning point for Operation Cherryblossom was not a battlefield engagement, but a command decision that fixed the boundary between concept and execution. By late March 1945, the proposal had been brought to a level where senior leaders were asked to approve an inter-service operation combining an Army-controlled biological capability with Navy-controlled delivery platforms. In later reconstructions, the plan is described as having been finalized on the 26th of March 1945 and then blocked at the level of the Army General Staff, associated with Chief of the Army General Staff General Yoshijiro Umezu. The effect of that decision was practical. Without Army authorization to provide the agent and accept institutional responsibility, the Navy could not execute a biological strike even if it retained delivery capacity. The arguments that shaped the decision were rooted in risk management under time pressure. Operational feasibility was uncertain because the delivery mechanism depended on a small number of specialized submarines, and because an airborne release of infected vectors could not guarantee geographic distribution, transmission pathways, or timing of observable effects. Strategic feasibility was also uncertain because the expected American response could not be controlled. Planners had to consider not only containment measures and public health mobilization, but also the possibility of intensified retaliation, including acceleration of existing air attacks and other punitive measures. In internal terms, approving the mission would have consumed scarce fuel, trained crews, and maintenance time for platforms that had alternative uses in conventional strike plans already under development. Once the biological concept was rejected, the remaining trajectory of the submarine aircraft program shows how narrowing options reinforced the decision. In June 1945, the Navy shifted its Saran force from a transoceanic infrastructure target to nearer objectives, first canceling the Panama Canal raid concept, and then ordering preparations for an attack on the U.S. fleet anchorage at Ulithi. This reorientation was a second turning point, because it acknowledged that Japan's ability to mount a distant raid was being compressed by attrition, base vulnerability, and the speed of Allied operations. It also demonstrated that the same limited platforms were being pulled toward missions with more immediate naval relevance, leaving less room for unconventional alternatives. For the United States, the turning point was the cumulative effect of forward advances and intensified pressure on Japan's remaining operational space. The capture of island bases, expansion of long-range patrol coverage, and the continuity of strategic air attacks reduced the probability that a rare Japanese platform could travel, coordinate, and surface for aircraft launch on a fixed schedule without interruption. The result was not a single barrier, but a rising density of detection and interdiction, risks that changed planning from possible in theory to unlikely in practice, even before Japan's final political decisions. The final irreversible turning point came in August 1945. After the Imperial announcement on the 15th August that hostilities would end, ongoing attack preparations were canceled, and deployed units received orders to stop offensive action and comply with surrender procedures. At that point, the constraints that had previously been debated as risks became absolute limits. Japan no longer had the political authority to initiate new operations, and the Allied occupation and disarmament process removed the means to do so. In operational terms, Cherryblossom passed its last viable window twice, first when it failed to obtain high-level approval in March, and again when the war ended in August, illustrating how late-war proposals could be technically imaginable while remaining strategically and institutionally unexecutable. The end of combat operations arrived before any version of Operation Cherryblossom could move beyond planning. In late August 1945, the immediate priority for Japanese units associated with submarine aviation became compliance with surrender orders while preventing sensitive material from falling intact into enemy hands. On August 26, 1945, I-400 and I-401 received instructions to hoist a black surrender flag and disarm. Their crews destroyed operational records and secret documents, and disposed of aircraft and munitions in ways intended to remove evidence of capabilities and procedures that had been built around surprise launch. Surrender at sea followed within days. I-400 was sighted east of Honshu and surrendered on 27 August 1945 to U.S. Navy destroyers operating in Task Force 38 coverage, after which a U.S. prize crew boarded and took the submarine under escort toward Japan. I-401 was detected off the Sanriku Bight and surrendered on the 29th of August 1945 after a U.S. submarine maintained contact and required her to stop. The sequence reflects a late-war operational reality. Even after Japan's political decision to end hostilities, communication delays, mechanical failures, and the fog of command authority shaped how individual crews transitioned from a war posture to surrender. In Sagami Bay and then Tokyo Bay, surrendered submarines became objects of rapid technical exploitation. From the Japanese perspective, crews were moved into prisoner of war status. Officers were separated for questioning, and some participants faced uncertainty about how their wartime roles would be interpreted under occupation. From the American perspective, the submarines represented rare opportunities to examine long-range hull design, aircraft stowage systems, catapult launch procedures, and endurance figures that had no direct U.S. equivalents in service. The same features that made these boats attractive for intercontinental strike concepts made them valuable intelligence targets once captured. The aftermath also included a second contest over access and information. As post-war relations between the United States and the Soviet Union hardened, captured Japanese submarines became politically sensitive. Under emerging Cold War conditions, the United States faced Soviet requests to inspect advanced Japanese submarine designs. In response, American authorities limited access and ultimately chose disposal rather than shared technical disclosure. I-400 and I-401 were transported to Pearl Harbor for evaluation, and then sunk as targets in mid-1946 in waters off Oahu, removing the platforms themselves as sources of transferable technology. For Operation Cherryblossom specifically, the immediate consequence was an absence. No biological release, no outbreak on the U.S. West Coast, and therefore no direct civilian aftermath in the intended target area. The operational withdrawal occurred inside institutions rather than on a battlefield. Japanese planners who had supported or opposed the concept moved into demobilization and interrogation under occupation, while U.S. investigators and intelligence officers sought to map the boundaries of Japanese biological warfare capability and determine what had been planned versus what had been produced and deployable. The result was a post-war record shaped by incomplete documentation, deliberate destruction of wartime materials, and competing incentives among participants to emphasize or minimize what they knew. In the first months after September 1945, The broader humanitarian and political environment overshadowed any single canceled operation. Japan faced occupation administration, repatriation of soldiers and civilians from across the former empire, food and housing shortages, and the reorganization of military institutions into disarmed structures. The United States shifted from wartime mobilization toward occupation responsibilities and demobilization, while also beginning to define a new security landscape in the Pacific. In that setting, Operation Cherryblossom persisted not as a concluded campaign, but as a closed decision path, whose most tangible remnants were technical artifacts, interrogations, and the post-war struggle over what information would be preserved, prosecuted, classified, or destroyed. In the historical record, Operation Cherryblossom is significant less for what it changed on the battlefield than for what it reveals about late-war decision-making under severe constraint. The plan combined two capabilities that existed for different purposes: an Army-controlled biological warfare program built for continental operations in East Asia, and a Navy-controlled platform designed for long-range surprise air attack, the I-400 class submarine aircraft carriers with Siran floatplanes. The proposed linkage illustrates how, by 1945, some Japanese planners explored options that sought strategic disruption without the ability to hold territory or sustain conventional operations at distance. For Japan's military institutions, the most direct legacy is institutional and technical. The II-400 program demonstrated that intercontinental submarine aviation was feasible in engineering terms, but its wartime utility was limited by production scale, training demands, and vulnerability of bases and logistics to air attack. In the final months of the war, the same scarce submarines and aircraft were repeatedly reassigned among competing missions, from distant infrastructure concepts to nearer fleet targets, showing how strategic planning compressed toward operations that could be attempted with shorter transit times and fewer assumptions. For the United States, the plan's historical importance lies in how it shaped post-war intelligence priorities and risk assessment. Captured submarine technology was examined for design lessons, while allegations and evidence about biological warfare programs prompted investigations aimed at determining what had been developed, what had been used, and what might have been deployable. In the early Cold War setting, control over these findings became part of broader policy choices about classification, prosecution, and scientific exploitation, influencing how much entered the public record and when. Operation Cherryblossom also sits at the intersection of evolving international norms. The 1925 Geneva Protocol prohibited bacteriological methods of warfare, but enforcement depended on political outcomes, and Japan's later ratification occurred decades after 1945. In the post-war period, the global legal framework continued to develop, culminating in broader prohibitions on biological weapons under later treaties. The operation is therefore often discussed in studies of how states interpret prohibitions during total war, and how post-war institutions try to translate those prohibitions into accountability and prevention. A continuing historical debate concerns feasibility versus intent. Some reconstructions emphasize that a specific target and date were proposed, while others stress that the plan exceeded available submarine numbers and relied on biological effects that could not be precisely controlled. That debate is shaped by fragmentary documentation, deliberate destruction of records during surrender, and the incentives of post-war testimony. As a result, historians often treat the operation as a case study in how extreme proposals can be simultaneously detailed in outline and uncertain in execution. In public memory, Cherryblossom is usually referenced alongside two broader subjects: the final year search for long-range strike options and the history of biological warfare research in East Asia. Commemoration and education tend to focus not on a battle narrative, but on institutional decisions, scientific and military integration, and the gap between planning concepts and operational reality. Its enduring significance is that it provides a concrete example of how, in 1945, strategy could shift toward high-risk, low-repeatability operations whose primary aim was psychological, logistical, and political disruption rather than conventional military advantage.